Well, welcome everybody. I want to thank you for joining us tonight at our first webinar. I am Bodie Moore, and I'm the site administrator of the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Eckley Miners Village. And I want to thank our partners for joining us today from Penn State Schuylkill, University of Maryland, and the Lackawanna Historical Society. So the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Eckley Miners Village are part of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And as many of you know, we've been shut down to the public since March, and we're likely going to remain closed until next March. So it'll be a full year due to COVID-19. So as part of our mission, we research and we collect items pertinent to the anthracite region in Northeast Pennsylvania. Both museums have collections specific to healthcare. Eckley, we have a doctor's office and a doctor's office exhibit, and at the Anthracite Museum we have a doctor's office exhibit in there as well. So we thought that we would gather our partners and friends together and take a more in-depth look at healthcare over the last 200 or so years in the region in the Anthracite region. You know, a lot of us, when we talk about broad healthcare issues, we focus on black lung, which has been a dominant injury for many of the miners. But our panelists today are going to talk a little bit more in depth about other pandemics in the region and some of the ways that we've managed other healthcare issues. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to thank our commentators for tonight. Cynthia Drazanovich, who is a community psychologist, whose research includes environmental and historical influences in communities. She earned a Master of Art and Bachelor of Science at Penn State University and an Associate in Applied Science from Central Pennsylvania College. In collaboration with the Smithsonian Institute in Penn State, Cynthia's research, Grieving the Gripe, the 1918 influenza epidemic in the anthracite coal region, examines the tremendous impact of the contagion in the region. She presented her work at the Pennsylvania Historical Association 2019 annual meeting at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Cynthia grew up in the anthracite coal region of Minersville, Schuylkill County, and works at Penn State Schuylkill. Sorry about that. Our other panelists, or our other commentators, Harold Rand Jr., who is an associate professor of teaching at Penn State Schuylkill campus. He arrived there in 1992, just after finishing graduate school at the University of Minnesota. He has published research on how communities respond to underground mine fires and on several topics of local cultural history. Working at Penn State is a family tradition. Harold's late father spent 36 years as professor of history at Penn State Hazelton campus, where he authored such books as From the Molly Maguires and United Mine Workers and Coal Cracker Culture. Excuse me. So the format for today is that each of our speakers will have some time to talk, and then Cynthia and Harold will make comments on their speech, on their talks. So we have the Q&A session open for questions if anyone wants to pose them, and then we will follow up from there. And I apologize about my phone going off. So our first speaker will be John Fielding from the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Eckley Miners Village. Mr. Fielding has been the curator at Anthracite Heritage Museum in Eckley since 2004. His time as a curator at the Anthracite, or his time as a curator has been spent working to catalog and research the Anthracite Museum complex collections and organize the inventory of its nearly 3,000 cubic feet of archival material. In addition to his collections work, Mr. Fielding has curated over 10 exhibits. So I will turn it over to John.
Well, thank you, Bodie. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. So my presentation is really the company doctor, healthcare in the community, 1890 to 1980. And what I'm really going to talk about are some of the doctors that are represented in the collections of the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Eckley Miners Village. Bodie did mention at Eckley we do have a company doctors building, company doctor's office. And this is the company doctor office at Eckley Miners Village. So when we do open up eventually, hopefully we will, stop by to Eckley and get a tour of the company doctor's office. This doctor's office is also where one of the doctors that I'm going to be speaking about actually attended to some of the patients at Eckley. So what is the Anthracite region? There might be some people here who aren't familiar with the Anthracite region. The Anthracite region is located largely in northeastern Pennsylvania. It is where approximately 90% of the world's reserves of anthracite are. And it encompasses really 4 fields, although this map only has 3. So the northernmost field is titled the Northern Field, and it's centered around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. The middle field here that's colored in red, we have, actually there's 2 fields there. Most maps indicate 2 fields. It's called the middle field, and we have an eastern middle field centered around Hazleton, and the western middle field with the cities of Shamokin, Ashland, Mahanoy City. And then we have the southern anthracite field, which is indicated in this map in blue. And those cities, prominent cities there are Pottsville, Tamaqua, those cities. So I'm just going to talk about some generalizations to healthcare in the region from 1890 to 1980. There were a number of environmental, socioeconomic, and industrial health concerns. Environmental health concerns included poor air and water quality. You had the rapid industrialization in the 19th century of the region and of pretty much the eastern United States. And burning of coal led to kind of a, coal was the main fuel to power the Industrial Revolution. Burning that coal, it actually kind of polluted the air. Well, not kind of, it did. It polluted the air, causing poor air quality. Industrial workings, polluted the water, thereby causing, poor water quality as well. And we have socioeconomic health concerns. During this time period that I'm going to talk about, the region had high poverty rates and poor access to professional health care. There was also industrial and workplace safety conditions. They weren't very good conditions. Mining was very dangerous. Some of the secondary and tertiary industries also had their own health and safety problems as well. A number of accidents in mining led to, a lot of chronic illnesses. So there were accidents. You had chronic illnesses such as black lung, which all kind of amplified the health problems within this area. And each of these sections, environmental, socioeconomic, and industrial, if you think of them as kind of like like each of them as circles, they all kind of overlap. So some of them led into others. The first doctor that I'm going to talk about, who's represented in our collection, is Dr. Alexander Armstrong. And I have him kind of under environmental health care, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So Dr. Alexander Armstrong was born in Trenton, New Jersey in 1873. He was the son of Irish immigrants. He went to school in the Trenton public school system, and eventually he went to Philadelphia and graduated from the Thomas Jefferson Medical College in 1895. After he graduated, he spent some time in Philadelphia working at hospitals, and then he moved back to Trenton, where he practiced medicine privately. And he also did work in some hospitals in Trenton as well. But in 1904, he contracted tuberculosis. And for those who aren't familiar with tuberculosis, it is a bacterial disease that infects a patient's lungs. So this disease at the time, 1904, really didn't have a cure. The treatment, one of the treatments for less severe patients, was to remove the patient from a area of poor air quality per se to sanitariums, which were usually located in rural areas that had better air quality. And the patients were usually, pushed outside onto on a little chair, a wheeled chair, and they sat outside a lot of times, breathed in this fresh air, and in a sense, it's kind of halted the progress of the tuberculosis bacteria that was in the lungs. It didn't cure it, but it just stopped the progress of the tuberculosis. So eventually, Dr. Alexander Armstrong, being at the Whitehaven Sanitarium as a patient, they found out he was a doctor. They did offer him a job once he was stabilized. And he took the job, relocating to Whitehaven, and eventually became superintendent of the Whitehaven Sanitarium. And at Eckley, we do have some of his patient cards, by the way, in our collection. But while he was at the sanitarium, he did write several articles about the treatment of tuberculosis, and including the present status of therapeutic pneumothorax in pulmonary tuberculosis. So what is therapeutic pneumothorax? And that's where this image comes in here. This was part of a therapeutic pneumothorax machine, I guess you could say. And it was actually used by Dr. Alexander Armstrong. A large collection of his medical equipment came to Eckley Miners Village in 1986, over 300 items that he used during his days practicing medicine. And this machine is part of the therapeutic pneumothorax machine that he used. So what exactly is therapeutic pneumothorax? Therapeutic pneumothorax was the most common treatment prior to the late 1940s to treat severe cases of tuberculosis. And what the physician would do is make an incision in the patient's lungs. This machine here, they would actually stick in some pipettes and drain some of the fluid out of the patient's lungs that was building up in the lungs from the tuberculosis, causing the lung to collapse. The collapsed lung would then heal itself, developing scar tissue. And the scar tissue that developed prevented the spread of the tuberculosis bacteria within that patient's lungs. So it wasn't a cure, it was just a treatment. And severe patients might have both lungs collapse, not at once, but over time, both lungs would be collapsed. And sometimes a lung could be collapsed multiple times to develop more and more scar tissue buildup to prevent the buildup of tuberculosis. This was still the main treatment for severe cases when Dr. Alexander Armstrong passed away in April of 1932. And it wasn't until around 1948 when antibiotics were developed to treat and cure tuberculosis. And at that same time, because of antibiotics were in use, sanitariums kind of fade away. So in the case of the Whitehaven Sanitarium, where Dr. Alexander Armstrong practiced his medicine, the Whitehaven Sanitarium then became eventually a state hospital, which it is today. So now I'm going to go into some of the socioeconomic doctors that we have. The two doctors I'm going to talk about in this category are Albert Augustus Redelin and Dr. Louis Christian Druffner Sr. And Dr. Redelin, he kind of embodies this first phase, I guess you could say, of healthcare in the Anthracite region. And so the first phase is kind of characterized, well, let me just backtrack. The first phase kind of takes place roughly from the end of the Civil War to about 1920. And it's characterized by this expansion of the anthracite industry, the expansion of production of anthracite, the expansion of the economy and the population of the region. So as the anthracite industry expands and the population expands, a lot of little towns start developing, patch towns. And each patch town or each company that owns a patch town might hire a particular doctor to administer healthcare to that particular patch town. And in the case of Eckley, we have Dr. Albert Augustus Redelin, who practiced his medicine in that first slide, that building in the first slide. So we also have at Eckley Miners Village in the visitor center his actual doctor's bag that he would use to make house calls. So while he practiced at Eckley from 1902 to 1906, the coal company, the Cox Brothers and Company, they took $1 from every mine worker's monthly pay, and that dollar would go to Dr. Redelin for him to provide healthcare services to the miner and their families. So in a way, it was sort of a very primitive health insurance policy. And other coal companies and railroad companies actually mimicked a similar service. It might not have been $1, but it could have been some other fee as well. But at Eckley, it was $1 during that time period. The problem with that is that Dr. Redelin was one doctor for one town of 1,400 people. So access to healthcare, professional healthcare, was very limited at that time. But if a patient did get to see Dr. Redelin, he could do just about anything. He, like most doctors at the time, were generalists. So if somebody was sick, he could go and treat the sick. So if they had, let's say, the flu, they could be treated. Smallpox, he could treat that. If they needed a tooth pulled, he could treat that. And so dentistry, some mild optometry, and he also helped deliver babies as well. But most people, as I said, had a hard time visiting the company doctor because it was only one doctor. So a lot of people in patch towns and communities throughout the anthracite region relied on, I guess you could say, home remedies, common chicken soup type things, and didn't actually get to see doctors until they were really sick. Hospitals also existed at the time that Dr. Redelin was practicing, but a lot of the region's hospitals, particularly there was a hospital over in nearby Drifton, they were really just dedicated to treating miners who were injured in severe accidents and those who had some chronic conditions like black lung, even though black lung wasn't identified until later on. So Dr. Redelin, he continues to practice after he leaves Eckley in 1906. He served several other coal companies, and he mainly practices out of the town of Freeland. During World War I, he enlists in the United States Army Medical Corps and goes to Chickamauga Camp in Tennessee, where he serves as a camp medical director. Interestingly enough, his son is also in this picture on the far left. His name is Albert Norman. He also, when World War I just broke out, graduated the Thomas Jefferson Medical College and served at the same medical camp as his father did in World War I. And Albert Norman, he later on returns to the area and also becomes a company doctor. So after World War I, Dr. Redelin, Albert Augustus Redelin, comes back to Freeland, where he remains practicing for the rest of his life. He passes away in 1933. But in between that time, there was also a smallpox epidemic in the Hazleton and Wilkes-Barre areas. So in 1923-24, he's appointed by the governor of Pennsylvania to dispense and free vaccinations to area children. The second doctor within socioeconomic situations that I want to highlight is Dr. Louis Christian Druffner. And Druffner's career, it kind of overlaps a little bit with Redelin's, but he's more in this second phase that I'd like to call, which goes roughly from about 1920 to about 1970. And this second phase is coupled by the decline of the anthracite industry. So in the 1920s, there's a series of prolonged strikes, which lead to increased competition with other fuels for market share for fuels, such as oil and natural gas. So they're starting to eat into anthracite's market. And that results a little bit in decline in employment as well as production. So there's a decline in employment during the 1920s. There's even a small recession within the anthracite region during the 1920s. And by the time the Depression hits in the 30s, the anthracite industry is really only about half of what it was in terms of employment than it was in 1917. So there was a significant decline in employment during that era. So Dr. Druffner's career, is coupled with this decline of the industry, creates more unemployment, which creates more poverty. And in some cases, it also creates more of a barter society. So some company doctors at the time, and doctors who practice privately, they would often charge nominal fees for their services because families couldn't afford them, or they would accept goods in exchange. So in the case of like Dr. Druffner, if he went and attended to a patient, instead of accepting money, maybe they would come and fix his car, like change a tire or something, or give him a pie, something like that. It was a barter system. But that wasn't always the case, but it did happen enough. Now, another thing is there's this gradual shift from house calls to office visits, as well as from the really sick just visiting, being seen by the doctors, to the really sick going right to hospitals. And in some ways, there's this increased access to medical care as more physicians enter into the area, especially in the 60s and 70s. So over here, we have an image of the Dr. Druffner's office equipment, which is on exhibit at the Anthracite Heritage Museum. So Dr. Druffner, he began practicing in 1918. So he graduated from the Thomas Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in 1918, goes right into the United States Army Medical Corps during World War I. And after World War I, gets discharged and comes back to Avoca, Pennsylvania, where he was born and grew up. He continues to practice in Avoca for the rest of his life until he passes away in 1970. And in the meantime, he does make a lot of house calls. So he's still in that phase where house calls were very common for doctors. But by the mid-1930s and into the 40s, he becomes more settled and has his own office. So here's his own office equipment. And one of the reasons why doctors shifted from making house calls to having appointments in their own offices, and the really sick went from seeing the doctor at a house call to a hospital, is because of sanitation. It was a lot easier for a doctor to keep his office sanitized than it was for a doctor to sanitize everything on a house call. Same thing, it's a lot easier to treat a patient in a sanitary condition in a hospital than it is or was, having the doctor go to the patient's house, making house calls. So there's that transition. And Dr. Druffner started making that transition. There was also a transition in Druffner's lifetime where doctors eventually became associated with a particular hospital. So Druffner in the 1940s becomes associated with nearby Taylor Hospital in Taylor, Pennsylvania. And he eventually becomes the chief of staff, a position which he holds for over 20 years. And he retires from that in the late 1960s, but he still practices for several more years. I have a poem here that was written by Charles Golden at an event honoring Dr. Louis Druffner Sr. on his 50 years of service in the Avoca area, which I'm going to read to everybody. And it's a good poem because it really gives you an idea of everything that a company doctor did for the community at the time. So here's the poem. We have often thought that as a doctor, in your makeup, you had an angelic strain, for regardless of weather, time of day, you came forth to relieve our pain. Perhaps a broken arm up at Houston City, Tuffer's Patch, pneumonia, heavy cold, Liddy's Road, someone has been badly burned, Little York, the ills, complaints of the old. Remember the incident at DuPont when a demented man met you with a gun, when you were on a mercy call, for your life you had to run. There are lots more incidents to write about. Some of the sadness when death was near, the joys, thrills of a new baby, where you assist nature, the mother we revere. Well, today we meet to do honor, pay tribute to a life well spent. Today we say thanks as we bow our heads, knowing that from heaven to us you were sent. So that's a kind of a good poem there that was written, as I said, in 1968, honoring Dr. Louis C. Druffner Sr. And it gives you an example of some of the things they had to do. And some of the names in there are kind of interesting. Houston City, Tuffer's Patch, they're different patch towns that were in the Avoca and Taylor areas. The next doctor that I'm going to highlight, and the final doctor that I'm going to highlight, is Dr. Herman H. Feisner. And Dr. Feisner, he was born at Eckley in 1906. And his family moved to Freeland around 1911. And he went to school locally, eventually graduating, though, from the Thomas Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. And this is in the mid-1930s when he graduated. He came back to the area and practiced medicine locally, making house calls to various patch towns, including Eckley and nearby patch towns like Highland and Jeddo, Drifton, and Upper Lehigh. He had an office on 634 Center Street in Freeland, which he maintained up until his death. But this medical bag belonged to Dr. Feisner, and it was recently donated to the Anthracite Heritage Museum by his family. And he used this medical bag to make house calls to deliver newborns through the various patch towns from 1937 to 1963. And it's interesting, when I found, when it was donated to us and I opened it up, it had been really the first time somebody had opened it up since 1963 when Dr. Feisner really packed it away for the last time. And it was interesting because it contained, this little bag is about 6 inches by 1 foot by 1 foot, and it contained over 140 items, 145 items to be exact, and including his smock, a hat, and all the tools that he needed to deliver newborns. So there was a lot of stuff packed in this bag, and it was done very efficiently. I was very astounded by how efficient he had packed all of his medical equipment. But I guess he needed to be efficient in order to do what he had to do. So in 1963, he stops delivering, making house calls to deliver newborns because the hospital in Hazleton, which was the nearest hospital, actually built a maternity ward. So St. Joseph's Hospital in Hazleton at that time built a maternity ward, and Dr. Feisner was able to deliver newborns from the maternity ward from that point on. And as I said, the reason why they built the maternity ward and he chose to deliver babies there was because of more sanitary, more controlled conditions. In addition to being in a private practice, he was also a Luzerne County coroner in the 1960s, and he worked at the Whitehaven State School and Hospital, which the predecessor to that was the Whitehaven Sanitarium, in the 1960s and 70s. In the late 1960s, he gets a series of patients, 3 patients really to be exact, come to him over a period of time with breathing problems. The breathing problem wasn't black lung. These men were not miners. Mining had subsided as an employer in that area. And so other people were getting jobs in other industries. They were not miners, but they were developing this breathing problem. One of his patients passed away as a result of complications. But Dr. Feisner eventually deduced that they had what's called beryllium poisoning. And after talking to the patients, he deduced that they both worked at the Kawecki Beryllico Industries plant in Hazel Township. And what is beryllium? So beryllium is a type of heavy metal that is used in a variety of industrial applications. And at this plant, they were taking this heavy metal and grinding it down to use in other applications. And so they were breathing in this powdered beryllium dust the workers were on a daily basis. So they ended up with beryllium poisoning, which, like black lung, is a progressive disease. Once you have it, you can never get cured from it. The beryllium dust, like coal dust, will always remain in a person's lungs. But they can stop the progression. And Dr. Feisner, he teamed up with some of the workers at the plant and made the case to the federal government and the state government that Kawecki Beryllico Industries should provide their workers with PPE, or protection protective equipment. And after a period of 4 years going back and forth in the courts, Kawecki Beryllico Industries finally acquiesced and agreed to provide respirators, goggles, hats, gloves, ponchos, that kind of things that was needed for safety measures. And after they did that to for their employees, there were no more cases or recorded cases of beryllium poisoning. So in a sense, Dr. Feisner goes kind of above and beyond what is needed from a doctor. His obligation was to treat his patients, which he did, but he also went and kind of played a social activist role and helped the community and the workers of that particular factory. So that's all I have for my presentation today. And
Thanks, John.
Yep, you're
welcome. Cindy or Harold, do you have any quick comments? Oops, you're on mute, Harold.
And okay, you mentioned all the physical artifacts, and
Oops. Harold, you just went back on mute.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Harold.
Yep, we're still not hearing it.
Hmm.
Okay, you mentioned the physical artifacts and the medical records, but are there any personal papers, especially for the earlier doctors?
Nothing, nothing for the earlier doctors.
Mhm.
Really, the Whitehaven Sanitarium records from Armstrong are the only patient records that we have. We do have some. They're not from doctors, but they are health records from some of the Anthracite Health and Welfare Fund applications. And they date late 40s, early 1950s. But they're not, I guess they're a medical collection, but they're not from a doctor in this perspective.
Okay.
Great. Oh, sorry, Cindy.
Oh, that's okay. I just have one sort of quick question. I was just curious with Alex Armstrong. You had mentioned, you know, his work that he came from Trenton and so forth. Did you say that he actually practiced at Eckley?
Armstrong did not practice at Eckley. No, he stayed in Whitehaven for most of his career, except that brief stint in Trenton, well, and Philadelphia early on in his career. Redelin was the doctor that practiced at Eckley, and although Armstrong was also a company doctor for the Lehigh Valley Railroad, so he did treat railroad employees and some of their mining operation employees too.
Okay, because I was curious how Eckley came to get. You said that, you know, Eckley had some of his possessions and some of his items specifically for treatment. So I was just kind of curious how that happened, how that was donated to Eckley, if, you know, what the connection was there.
I think proximity.
Okay.
So Whitehaven is fairly close to Eckley, and when the people who inherited his medical items thought of a good home for them, they donated them to Eckley.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, John. So we'll move on to our next presenter, Sarah Piccini, who is the Assistant Director of the Lackawanna Historical Society. She received a master's degree in history from the University of Scranton in 2010, and her recent research has focused on anniversary events, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, as well as what made Scranton a suffragette city. Sarah is a former board member of the Pennsylvania Anthracite Heritage Museum and currently serves as the business secretary for the Pennsylvania Historical Association. Turn it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Bodie. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It turns out that my Spanish flu research came rather in handy this year. In the spring, everybody wanted to talk about Spanish flu as the only thing left to rely on when the coronavirus started. So the research ended up coming in handy this year. Let me get my presentation started here. In the interest of time, I'll jump right in and kind of keep it as brief as I can. I know that I think Sarah is going to talk a little bit about Spanish flu as well. To start with, a bit of semantics. Spanish flu didn't come from Spain. There's a little bit of debate about where it actually started. There are reports of a flu outbreak in Asia or also in Kansas. So there's a little bit of debate about where it came from, but it takes the name Spanish flu mainly because Spain was a non-combatant country during World War I. So most reports that people saw, the first reports that people saw of this horrific flu were coming out of Spain. So it kind of associated the name. It was a flu that attacked young people at a higher rate than normal. Usually it's children and the elderly. Spanish flu killed mainly people between the ages of 20 and 40. It was in most respects a regular flu with chills, body ache, fever, cough, congestion, but at a very, very high degree. There are reports of people turning blue from lack of oxygen, autopsies being performed where it looked like lungs looked very similar to soldiers who had been in poison gas attacks in the trenches. It was a very, very strong form of the flu. The flu in the United States killed enough young people to lower the average life expectancy in the United States by 10 years. To start, I'm focusing mainly again on Scranton. Influenza came to Scranton in much the same way that it came to Philadelphia, following a full patriotic turnout at a Liberty Loan Parade. The first reports of multiple cases of flu appeared on October 1st after the city's September 28th kickoff of a Liberty Loan Drive. A full day of festivities was planned, from a 9 a.m. kickoff of the campaign to a lunch for organizers at the Scranton Club and a trench supper under Courthouse Square for women workers, followed by a grand parade and a rally at the Watrous Armory. An estimated 5,000 people marched and 8,000 attended the rally and choral performances in the Armory. The local loan drive was a success. Within a day, the C.S. Weston, the chair of the loan drive, reported $1.6 million had been raised in 1918, which is very impressive. However, unfortunately, within 48 hours, it was just enough time for the incubation of the virus, and the Scranton Republican newspaper reported that Bellevue, a neighborhood of Scranton, is all one shudder and tremendous sneeze, with an estimated 300 cases of grip in that section of Scranton, as well as many cases in West Scranton and a full share in South Scranton. Doctors making up to 60 house calls a day, and without nurses, fathers are required to stay home from work to take care of their families. Dr. Brown's pharmacy in Southside worked overtime to keep up with prescriptions. As the epidemic took hold, Dr. Samuel Longstreet, the director of the Scranton Department of Health, tried to explain the seriousness of the outbreak. He understood that cooperation was the key to curtailing influenza. Longstreet called it the most serious in some respects of any case of grip in the past 25 years, and warned people not to consider it as a trivial trouble, since it creates the groundwork for secondary attacks of lobar pneumonia. Longstreet recommended that sick people should not be out in public for at least a week after illness, noting that the grip is deceitful, and even those who think they have recovered are still at some risk for developing pneumonia. The Red Cross stepped in, asking volunteers to make face masks to help prevent the spread of the flu. There's even a pattern included in the newspapers that looks strikingly similar to the face mask that I've been making since March. As of October 4th, by order of the Pennsylvania Commissioner of Health, Dr. B. Franklin Royer, all public gathering places, including churches, theaters, saloons, dance halls, and clubhouses, were closed to curb the spread of influenza. On October 5th, Longstreet and Mayor Alex Connell ordered the closure of all schools and libraries in Scranton. Still, the epidemic spread. By October 7th, the Department of Health reported 416 cases of influenza in Scranton and noted that 15 people had died. It would only get worse. On October 9th, Dr. Longstreet reported that 26 people had died in the previous 24 hours, 6 of whom had been ill for only a few hours. The epidemic didn't let up. By October 10th, the city reported 1,010 confirmed cases of influenza. The next day, it rose to 1,347 cases and 48 deaths. Public health restrictions were increased, impacting on a deeply religious community looking to its churches for consolation. To lessen the risk of contagion, public funerals were banned. Bishop Hoban agreed with this, sending an open letter to all parishes on October 12th, regretfully asking them to cease all public church services, including funerals and confessions, and asking pastors to warn their congregations not to visit the sick nor houses where the dead are awaiting burial, and not to attend any funerals. One of the major problems with the epidemic was the need for nurses. Without a viable treatment for the flu, doctors were of less use than nurses, whose palliative care was really all that could be done. The war made nurses scarce, as many had volunteered for military duty. The Red Cross put out a call to mobilize nurses and nurses' aides, as well as midwives and any women who had taken the Red Cross courses in hygiene and home nursing. Advice abounded on how to prevent the flu, with even dry goods stores stepping in with their own advice. Michael Bozak advertised his Horcovino tonic as a proven cure, and Samters advertised the durability of their rock tan shoes, claiming, "A little bug will get you if you don't watch out. Keep your feet dry." In Scranton and the surrounding towns, the religious community stepped in to help fill the void. The Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary were called upon by Bishop Hoban to act as nurses in troop after the town's 2 doctors fell ill with flu and could no longer see patients. The sisters also helped at St. Joseph's, which opened an emergency shelter for children whose parents were too sick to care for them, and assisted the Franciscan Sisters at St. Mary's Keller Hospital in South Scranton. The Sisters of Mercy operated Mercy Hospital and also assisted at the emergency hospital established at the nearby Watrous Armory. The nuns offered prayers for the sick and wore Sacred Heart badges for special protection. 2 IHM sisters were hospitalized for the flu but survived. 4 Sisters of Mercy died of influenza in mid-October. The magnitude of the epidemic overran hospitals. On October 12th, with 1,534 cases of flu reported in Scranton, a 500-bed hospital was opened in the Waters Armory, with separate wards for men, women, and children. Staffing the hospital was a community effort. Dr. H.W. Albertson was placed in charge of the hospital, and Dr. Anna Clark, who had been the first female doctor in Scranton, was placed in charge of the nurses. Miss Ann Jones of Technical High School acted as a dietitian, and Mrs. Grant Siebert, chief of the Domestic Science Department of ICS, was in charge of housekeeping. Public school teachers, idle while schools remained closed, volunteered as nurses, and Mayor Connell put out a call for donations of old linens, bedpans, and screens to help furnish the hospital. By mid-October, the flu was far from over. On October 15th, the health department recorded 2,217 cases in Scranton, with 1,799 homes placarded and 101 deaths in the roughly 10 days since the city began asking doctors to keep track. The rapid death rate began to cause problems for those who usually dealt swiftly with death: casket manufacturers, undertakers, and gravediggers. 3 casket companies in Scranton reported a scarcity of caskets, saying that medium-priced caskets were practically absent from the market. The Miller Casket Company started 24-hour production to cope with a 60% increase in orders, even hiring women to fill jobs usually held by men. To cope with the spread of the flu, emergency hospitals began to open across the valley. On October 18th, there were 4,442 cases of the flu in Lackawanna County as a whole. Troup and Dixon City seemed the hardest hit, with 555 and 475 cases respectively. A tent hospital was erected on the grounds of the Mid-Valley Hospital for 25 to 30 patients, and women of the Valley were asked to donate their time, towels, and kitchen utensils to help operate the hospital. Hospitals were opened at the high schools in Simpson, Archibald, and Old Forge, while a proposed hospital in Taylor was postponed for 2 days because there was no trained nurse to take charge. Nuns from Holy Ghost and St. Patrick's convents, along with the daughters of the saints of Saints Cyril and Methodius, operated an emergency hospital in Oliphant in the Knights of Columbus Hall. Additional precautions were put in place to keep the epidemic contained. Roughly 200 new cases were reported each day, and the death toll hovered in the mid-20s, with the spike to 39 on October 25th. By October 19th, the health department recorded 2,956 cases of flu in Scranton and 197 confirmed deaths. Dr. Longstreet requested that milkmen stop delivering bottles to homes that were under quarantine, not wanting bottles used by those who were sick to be placed back in circulation. Milk could still be delivered to these homes, but must be poured into containers left out by the families. Longstreet also asked the Scranton Railway Company to run additional cars along their routes to eliminate overcrowding on the trolley cars. Samter's department store published a notice that they would close on Saturday evenings, eliminating the busy crowds of weekend shoppers. Even Halloween was canceled. Health department authorities requested assistance in enforcing the precautions that were set, especially the ban on public funerals and saloon closures. The Department of Public Safety ordered guards posted at cemetery gates and near homes where funerals were being held after 1,000 people were reported in the vicinity of a single funeral. The saloon closure was also rather hard hit. There are reports across the newspapers of raids on hotels that were doing a backdoor business in cocktails. The rapidly growing numbers of the flu cases and the deaths are overwhelming as you're going through them, but the individual stories are heartbreaking. Some victim stories were elaborated in newspaper columns, but most simply appear in a list. The Scranton Times began publishing a list on October 7th, listing names and addresses, and sometimes noting which hospital they died or if a family member recently died as well. Among the first 31 deaths published were Scranton residents Miss Ruby G. Adams, a 25-year-old clerk for the DL&W Railroad, and Benjamin B. Davis, the 31-year-old manager of the Economy Furniture Store. Also listed are the 27-year-old Mrs. Harry Cope of Carbondale, Daniel Stewart, a 34-year-old munitions worker from Old Forge, and 5 men and 2 women who have been residents of Scranton but died at military camps. On October 16th, Mrs. Jessie Jones and Mrs. Arthur Luce appear on the list with the additional notation that they were sisters. Also on the list that day is Miss Mary Howler, a 31-year-old graduate nurse from Scranton, who, the Times notes, died in Stroudsburg, where she went to tend the sick. Some days families are listed together. On October 22nd, Mrs. M. Sear, an infant, of Vandling, and Mrs. William E. Jones, an infant, of Oliphant, as well as siblings Jane and Charles Freeman of Dixon City, are all on the influenza death roll. All flu deaths are tragic, but each was a part of many. Authorities reporting to be greatly alarmed several times during the month, but a peak was reached on October 23rd with flu cases nearing 4,000 and more than 50 deaths in a 24-hour period. Luckily, the epidemic was waning, and the world was actually losing interest. By October 31st, the city's health department reported a total of 5,106 cases of influenza and 507 deaths. 112 new cases had been reported in the previous 24 hours, but authorities believed that the epidemic had reached its crest, and from now on, better results would be looked for. Dr. Longstreet and his colleagues were correct. The epidemic was waning, but there was still a long way to go. The rush of new cases had slowed considerably, with only 10 new cases reported for November 6th, down from more than 200 each day in October. It was announced that the ban closing all theaters, saloons, churches, and schools would be lifted at noon and on Saturday, November 9th, but Longstreet warned Scrantonians against getting too frisky when the ban was lifted and urged people not to rush out to enjoy themselves and stay home if they were still coughing and sneezing. Brewers and bottlers went into high gear to supply theaters and saloons that had been closed for more than a month. Unfortunately for Longstreet's careful warnings, the lifting of the ban coincided with the end of the war, and little could be done to stop spontaneous crowds from gathering to celebrate. On November 11th, the day the armistice took effect, Scranton reported 11 new flu cases, bringing the total to 5,646 cases and 693 deaths. But still, the city cut loose to make up for the dull times of the past 5 weeks. The Armory Hospital was closed, and the patients had dwindled to a manageable number that could be absorbed by other hospitals. The only other thing not quite back to normal were the schools. They were given an extra few days holiday to celebrate the armistice. Smaller outbreaks continued through November, but by November 23rd, Longstreet cautiously reported that the epidemic had been mastered and credited people's cooperation with the health department's precautions as a big help in getting the upper hand on influenza. Publicly, the city was moving on. Flu was overshadowed by the end of the war. It became a personal problem rather than a public health concern. Spanish flu and its attendant pneumonia claimed the lives of more than 940 people in less than 3 months in Scranton, helped along, I believe, by the environmental hazards of living and working in the coal region. Local residents were at a disadvantage even before the outbreak hit. Coal miners, with long exposure to the dust and grit of the mines, already had respiratory problems like black lung before the flu virus attacked their already weakened respiratory systems. A recent study comparing pre and post epidemic pneumonia rates in 66 U.S. cities cited a susceptibility to pneumonia in Scranton. The city had an average pneumonia death rate of 212 per year from 1910 to 1917, was the third highest in the country. The study found a correlation between pre-epidemic pneumonia and the epidemic pneumonia death rate, so that it would seem that Scrantonians were predisposed to fatal pneumonia that accompanied influenza. Spanish flu had a profound impact on life in the city. Children were out of school, and many would soon find themselves orphans. The coal industry operated at a reduced capacity when it was most needed during the war. The closing ban took most of the fun out of daily life. Even daily tasks like milk delivery or shopping were circumscribed. Attempts by the Army Medical School to create a vaccine during the epidemic were proved ineffective, and it wasn't until 1938 that the first successful flu vaccine was synthesized. Today, vaccines are encouraged for all, especially children and those with underlying conditions. When I started doing this research in 2018, it was an interesting story of an event from long ago. Now it's kind of an eerie deja vu, and it's hard not to draw comparisons. The sense of an otherwise regular virus potentially causing havoc on bodies. The public closures and the face mask policies. War mobilization helped with the spread, but what was abnormal movement then was everyday life now. In the end, without a vaccine, Spanish flu faded out basically due to herd immunity after a fairly staggering death toll. The end result in the United States after 2 years was around 675,000 people who died. In Scranton, the number ends up just over 1,000 by the beginning of 1919. I wasn't able to find another bigger surge after that, It does seem to have died out relatively early in 1919, at least specifically in Scranton. It's not perhaps very comforting, but the best lessons you could take from Spanish flu to apply to today is to keep your distance, keep your face covered, and hang in there.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Harold and Cindy, do you have any comments?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. That was really interesting. When I did the research on the coal region down in our area, I found a lot of, in the earlier stages and even into it, sort of resistance from community. Even though bars and churches and so forth were being shut down, I found a lot of underground work, you might say, where they're kind of still sneaking out and hanging out and playing their cards and doing whatever. Did you find any of that in your research for up in that area?
I did. In Scranton, I said there was a lot of the saloon closure was particularly unpleasant. That did not exactly go over well. There was also there was a priest in the Mid Valley who was insistent on having masses. He was planning to hold outdoor masses like a festival. He was resistant to the church closures. They came up sporadically. I didn't see anything locally about like an anti-mask league or people refusing to wear face masks. It was more the bars.
Right.
They were the problem. But there was definitely some pushback to places being closed.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. Let me remind our attendees that if you're interested in asking a question, the question and answer function is working, so you can type in a question and then we will get that to the speakers. And also, if you're enjoying the program tonight, I did put links to both the Eckley and Anthracite PayPal donation websites if you want to make a contribution. So our next speaker, following on with Sarah's discussion of Spanish flu, is Sarah Sporco, who is a recent graduate from Misericordia University, where she earned a dual Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Government, Law and National Security with an English minor. Over the summer, she worked at Eckley Miners Village as a summer education assistant with assistance from the PA Career Link, Luzerne County and EDSI Solutions, where she updated their volunteer tour manual, created digital copies of Eckley's oral histories, and updated the collection records in the PHMC database. Before graduating, Sarah also interned with the National Archives and Records Administration, which was cut short due to COVID-19. And she also previously interned with the Anthracite Heritage Museum in 2018, assisting with the Anthracite Photographers of Anthracite exhibit under the supervision of Jennifer Black. So thanks, and take it away, Sarah.
So I will be talking about, can everyone hear me? Sorry, my mute off. Okay. So I'm focusing more on comparing the Spanish flu and Spanish flu and COVID-19 on the city of Hazleton and how the management of both differed slightly, and whether the city of Hazleton has learned their lesson from the past. So we'll first talk about the Spanish flu. In Pennsylvania, in total, there were about 60,000 deaths. In a report that was published in 1919, almost 35,000 were affected from the Spanish flu pandemic in Luzerne County, and it neared 2,600 deaths total. And according to my research in the Wilkes-Barre record, they reported that it was hard to keep doctors found it hard to keep track, and therefore it was hard to keep the official count of how many actually died from the Spanish flu in Hazleton. So Hazleton was in Luzerne County, it was Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton as the two hardest hit cities. And main reasons why Hazleton was one of the hardest hit cities is because most of the citizens did not follow any of the recommended guidelines from the mayor. Working conditions, everyone was cramped up working together side by side with no proper PPE. Living quarters, everybody lived together in one roof. They had multi-generational families, so you had your parents, grandparents all living in one roof, and when one person got sick, everyone ended up getting sick, and then due to the no PPE at work, it spread from there. And then also travel, everyone traveled and commuted from Philadelphia. So once Philadelphia was hit with the Spanish flu, it kind of just branched out from there, which led it to city of Hazleton as well as the rest of Pennsylvania. So the specific management of the Spanish flu in Hazleton in October of 1919, when cases were starting to soar, mayor and city officials ordered that all public places to be closed, including saloons, theaters, pool rooms, churches, Sunday schools, schools, public and private, lodge rooms, societies, public libraries, club rooms, the YMCA and YWCA, and everything except if they served food. If a business did serve food, they did have to limit the number of people that were in the business. Public funerals were also banned and limited to immediate family members only, and had a strict guidelines of 15 minutes per funeral. The police did check in to see who was following the guidelines. There were reports of raids on different underground activities because the saloons were closed. Several buildings were turned into temporary hospitals and wards to deal with all of the people, to deal with all the residents who were getting sick. And interesting enough, coal mining was not shut down during this time. However, it was reduced to operations. And I did find that foremans were supposed to keep an eye on all of the coal miners to see who was sick and send anybody home that was sick. Oh, well, so next going into COVID-19 in Hazleton. So jump forward about 100 years, you're gonna find everything shockingly a little bit similar. So as of October 10th, 2020, Pennsylvania has a total of 167,000 cases with over 8,000 deaths. Also in Luzerne County specifically, there are about 4,400 cases with 190 deaths. And in Hazleton, there are 1,400 total cases. Hazleton was the hotspot in Luzerne County, actually getting more cases than Wilkes-Barre this time around. And there are actually several reasons why. Again, one of the main reasons was working conditions, because there are several factories in Hazleton. One of them is Cargill Meat Solutions that was actually shut down for about 2 weeks in April because about 130 of their employees had tested positive for the coronavirus out of 900, and they were not given proper PPE to work with in the beginning. Now under state mandates, every business has to supply proper PPE. Again, living quarters is another big issue. There are multi-generational families still living together under one roof, which is leading to a big spread. And there's also a language barrier. In Pennsylvania, there has been an issue where most of the coronavirus updates and updates have been published in English only, where in Hazleton there is a large Spanish-speaking population, which has led to which has led to the miscommunication among groups. And then travel was another big issue. Mark's bus still had travel from New York City, which was one of the epicenters in the United States, and it brought many people from New York City and Philadelphia, which had the virus spread. And then a lot of newspapers were reporting on the ethnic problem in Hazleton due to the large Spanish Latino population. However, this is kind of a controversial issue because many don't see it as a problem, whereas some media are trying to make it a problem. So in order to combat the spread of COVID-19 in Hazleton, the mayor of Hazleton and Luzerne County manager ordered a city curfew, which was from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. And the only people that were allowed on the roads were those that traveling to work, and they had to show proof that they were going to work. Otherwise, you would be cited and fined. Crowd management, the state of Pennsylvania did issue a statewide mandate on the number of people in businesses and crowds, and they did do a statewide shutdown this time. PPE distribution, not all businesses were giving workers and employees proper protection gear, and that led to many employees getting sick and also increasing the spread of the virus. And testing, this virus, you would only know if you had the virus through testing, means of testing, and there was not a large portion of the population being tested in the beginning of the pandemic. So just comparing both the Spanish flu and COVID-19, both mitigation efforts didn't start until after the numbers of cases began to soar. For the Spanish flu, it was between October and December, whereas COVID-19, it was April and May. Both had similar mitigation efforts. Most businesses were shut down, crowds were limited. There was bans on everything. Labor and living conditions were both the same, whereas there was no proper PPE for employees, and everyone was stuck together at work. There was no one had proper space to work, and living conditions, everyone was crowded, and everyone lives in crowded apartments and houses. Both had travel to hotspots throughout the nation that still continued well into the pandemic, and there were temporary hospitals set up in the city throughout both pandemics. So was the lesson learned from the past? I would have to say no, because while Hazleton had more resources at its disposal than in the past, but mitigation efforts did not start until after the fact to control the pandemic, where if they started them in the beginning, say March, a lot of these cases could have been down. And just to note that COVID-19 is still ongoing, so this issue is probably going to be analyzed over and over in coming years, depending on when the pandemic officially ends. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Harold or Cindy, any comments or questions right now?
Hi, Sarah. I just have one little question. I don't know if you came across anything. Again, when I did the research in Schuylkill County, I was just curious if you found any cases where the coal barons in the area helped community at all.
I didn't find any direct resources, but I do know that they did have their doctor at disposal for the coal mining community to help with the coal miners.
Okay, so they were more inclined to help the families and communities up there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Cindy, if I could jump in a little bit. I know in Scranton, I think it was the D&H mines at one point were testing miners before they went into the mines, or they were testing every day. If you showed certain symptoms or whatever, they did have a policy to test people as they were going into the mines. I don't know how long it lasted, but there was at least a solid few weeks or so. But they did institute a regular testing policy.
And it was like their sort of their funds coming from their own.
Yeah, it was done at each mine. The colliery doctor was testing people before they were going to work.
I have to say that's stark different from the Schuylkill region and sort of the experience here. There was only one case of a coal baron actually putting his own money into it. So that's kind of a little bit of a difference there.
Maybe they were just nicer in Scranton.
Maybe, yeah. Well, I think it's still kind of like that. But,
I was just going to ask, when you were taking a look at COVID-19, did the folks in Hazleton consciously look back to the 1918 flu? Did they try to see what they'd done back there and copy it? Or did it just kind of, did they invent this on their own, the shutdowns and such?
Well, I think everyone kind of looked to the 1918 pandemic in the past to see what was done and what worked and what didn't work. But I also think that the shutdowns kind of just happened naturally on their own. A lot of them were statewide shutdowns, but the curfew in Hazleton was actually instituted by the mayor and Luzerne County manager because there was such a growing number of cases rapidly.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah. So our last speaker of the night is Kyla Cools, who is a doctoral student and instructor in the anthropology department at the University of Maryland. She received her BA from Michigan State University and her master's from the University of Maryland. Her research interests include global health, labor studies, and cultural resource management. So take it away, Kyla.
All right, thanks, Bodie. Let me just share my screen with you all. All right, sorry, one moment. All right, so I'll just jump right into it. So the Industrial Revolution marks a major turning point in history, influencing dramatic shifts and facets of life such as production, consumption, migration patterns, and social structures, among other phenomena. Historical archaeologists have worked to further our understanding of the various impacts of the Industrial Revolution, particularly surrounding the interpretation and conservation of industrial monuments and landscapes ranging from factories and mines to company towns. However, one aspect of the Industrial Revolution that has yet to be thoroughly addressed by historical archaeologists is that of injury, disability, and debilitating illness of industrial laborers as a result of occupational hazards. Some major questions that need to be explored include, do all industrial laborers deal with similar exposure to health risks in their respective roles? What inequities are present in terms of access to medical treatment? What role do intersectional facets such as social class and/or ethnicity play in the feasibility of obtaining medical treatment? The coal mining patch towns of northeastern Pennsylvania serve as an ideal case study in which archaeologists can explore these questions. So as many of you know, coal mining is an industry associated with workplace fatalities and health risks ranging from black lung disease, also known as silicosis, to other communicable diseases and loss of limb. Coal miners face health hazards in both the workplace as well as their homes and communities. These risks, however, did not impact all colliery workers and their families equally. To illustrate how these risks impacted different groups, I utilized archaeologically recovered material from Eckley Miners Village to examine the ways that structural violence and the social gradient manifest themselves in the archaeological record. This emphasis on material culture is significant because much of the literature on the archaeology of disabilities has been explored through bioarchaeology, so primarily skeletal remains in prehistoric contexts. By reframing the way material culture is interpreted in historical archaeology, we can better understand the nuances regarding how health, well-being, and disability can be recognized and studied in the archaeological record. So Eckley Miners Village is a living history museum located in Luzerne County in northeastern Pennsylvania. Originally a coal mining town, also referred to as a patch town, Eckley Miners Village was built in 1854 by Sharp, Lysenring and Company. The village continued to operate as a center of colliery operations and a patch town until the mid-20th century, though employment and population declined dramatically after the turn of the century as the industry changed from deep tunnel mining to strip mining. Following the 1968 filming of the Paramount Pictures movie, The Molly Maguires, members of the surrounding community formed the Anthracite Historical Site Museum Incorporation and purchased Eckley Miners Village from current property owner George Huss for $100,000, which they then donated to the property to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Following that, the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission was charged with the preservation and management of Eckley Miners Village as a living history museum. So interpreting the physical layout of the village has been a major research component for almost all archaeological excavations at Eckley. As early as 1860, just 6 years after the establishment of the village, sociologist Matthew Henry, while writing a local history of the Lehigh Valley, described the general settlement of the village as possibly the most complete of any mining town in the state. He goes on to detail the 4 sections of that town that correlated with grade, meaning the socio-economic status of the job an individual held at the colliery. And Henry provided the following description of these sections. So the cottages of the proprietors in one section, the boss laborers and contractors in another, the miners in a third, and second-class miners and slate pickers in another. So this socioeconomic correlation between career and house grade in the company can be viewed as a material manifestation of the social gradient, which is a concept that argues within a community, people further down the social ladder face higher risk of illness and premature death than those at the top of the ladder due to social and economic conditions. The concept of the social gradient is particularly significant in relationship to health at Eckley Miners Village, and by extension, other coal mining patch towns in northeastern Pennsylvania, because it implies that in lower grades of colliery work, which subsequently received lower wages, individuals had less ability to obtain professional medical treatment from the provided company doctor. Despite the theoretical feasibility of having a certain level of access to the company doctor due to the regular payroll deductions for the doctor's services, the practical feasibility of being able to afford any potential additional fees, treatment costs, and the wait times that could be incurred by utilizing the prepaid company doctor, those services were out of reach for many families. Particularly those on the lower rungs of the social hierarchy at Eckley Miners Village. These additional fees, treatment costs, and wait times were typically incurred by women and children whose health needs were not prioritized by mining companies and therefore were subjected to additional charges for certain services. Adding an intersectional dimension to how social circumstances impact access to professional health care. So this inequity regarding access to professional health care also has ties to the concept of structural violence. And now structural violence refers to social structures and or institutions that do harm by preventing people from meeting their basic needs. Many times this is by depriving individuals of the agency to make specific choices that could lead to better health outcomes. So where was I? And when considering the level of control mining companies held over their employees, as well as the environmental impact of coal mining on the environment surrounding the colliery and therefore the communities surrounding the colliery, it becomes increasingly clear that mining companies had an exorbitant amount of power over the health of their employees, embodying a kind of biopower. Over colliery workers, those on the lower rungs of the social ladder face greater obstacles to avoiding disease, injury, and death. As medical anthropologist Paul Farmer notes, structural violence can present itself through manifestations of wealth disparities, illness, and disease, and serves as an interpretive reinforcement to perceiving the graded organization of the village as a manifestation of these disparities, right? So utilizing this graded organization of Eckley Miners Village and the connotations associated with it, archaeologists like me can actually use the house lots and the associated archaeological assemblages within these different sections of the village as a basis for comparative analysis of material culture. So since archaeological excavations began at Eckley Miners Village in 1986, there have actually been 13 archaeological excavations and surveys, which have identified 58 archaeological sites at Eckley. This provides an astounding amount of data for analysis. In order to identify which archaeological collections are associated with households with someone where a physical disability or debilitating illness resided, I utilized several historical documents in various archives. So these included federal census records, colliery accident records, applications to the Anthracite Health and Welfare Funds, company doctor patient cards, and using all these records together, it was possible for me to cross-reference certain individuals and identify the households in which Eckley Miners Village had residents who were either living with a physical disability, a debilitating illness, or both. So once I identified individuals from Eckley Miners Village, oh, I just said all of that, sorry. Okay. So all this data allows me to identify specific assemblages to analyze at these specific house lots, right? As well as being able to identify future sites for targeted excavations. By comparing the assemblages against households that did not have residents recorded as having been injured in workplace accidents or suffering from a debilitating disease, I have been able to identify some valuable information regarding frequencies of specific artifacts in the archaeological record. For example, the proportions of patent versus prescription medicine bottles can provide information about how families at both ends of the social ladder chose to allocate scarce funds in order to treat a variety of ailments. However, when considering that professional medical care was not always economically feasible, reflections surrounding folk medicine and self-medication must also be considered. However, as folk medicines frequently consisted of organic materials, they present a challenge to identify and interpret archaeologically, particularly since the anthracite coal region has highly acidic soils. Self-medication is a bit easier to identify in the archaeological record, especially with notes from historian Susan Weaver that most miners turn to alcohol to deal with the symptoms of diseases such as black lung. Not only this, but many prescription medications at the time also contained high amounts of alcohol as well, providing another layer of nuance to the presence of alcohol bottles and the discourse surrounding addiction in both historical records and contemporary communities. So to illustrate how some of the aforementioned sources can be utilized to explore questions relating to health throughout the material record, I'm highlighting some artifacts from our 2015 and 2018 excavations at Eckley Miners Village. So this first case I'm going to present is that of Anthony Sokolsky at 104 Main Street. House lot 104 consists of one of the halves of a two-story double house and is located in a section of the village where miners resided and is noted by to be the second lowest on the social ladder at Eckley Miners Village. Unfortunately, due to limitations in the census data, only information for the occupants of this home can be identified for 1920, 1930, and 1940. And though the occupants during the 1920s were identifiable, they were not located in any secondary documentation such as accident records. Though during the 30s and 40s, the occupants are identified in multiple sources relating to healthcare and disabilities. So as listed in the 1930s federal census, the residents at 104 Main Street were the Sokolsky family. Anthony and Ava Sokolsky were a US-born couple of Russian and Polish descent who had 6 children together over the course of their lives. Anthony was born, raised, and died in Eckley Miners Village. And in the 1930s, his employment with the colliery was listed for the first time. By the 1940s, Anthony was working as a miner and he continued to work as one until 1958. Unfortunately, in 1961, Anthony passed away at the age of 63 due to complications from black lung. Less than a year before his passing, however, Anthony made an application to participate in a study by Jefferson Medical Hospital for research on and treatment of silicosis. This application identified that Anthony struggled from shortness of breath that left him unable to walk up coal vein slopes or stand, and that he also struggled with frequent chest colds and pain in his chest. So, within the archaeological assemblage recovered from 104 Main Street, there are a number of artifacts that hold relevance to Anthony Sokolsky and the health issues he faced. Some of these artifacts, such as a Pond's cold cream jar and a Listerine bottle dating to the late 1930s and 40s, are typically associated with personal cosmetic treatments today. However, when considered through a different lens, these artifacts can take on a different meaning. Associated with the cooling sensation, which give cold creams their names, the product and its patented extract presented in the products produced by Pond's have also been advertised as a cure-all on ailments ranging anywhere from aches and burns to skin inflammation and sore muscles. Though it is impossible to definitively associate this artifact with Anthony Sokolsky specifically, it's worth considering that he might have utilized this cold cream to deal with skin irritations and aches that could be incurred from mining activities, helping us understand a bit of how he embodied the damage caused by his own work. Similarly, Listerine, though typically associated with oral health to treat bad breath and sore throats, it also has a lesser known history. So advertisements from the early 20th century indicate that Listerine was also sold as a surgical disinfectant and a remedy for communicable diseases ranging from diphtheria to dysentery and ringworm to smallpox and gonorrhea. Due to the numerous ways in which colliery workers faced risks of experiencing skin lacerations, Listerine becomes a much more vital product to a miner's household than it may initially appear. Additionally, Anthony Sokolsky's application to the Anthracite Health and Welfare Funds indicates that he experienced coughing fits up to 7 hours a day. It's possible that due to these, he also utilized Listerine in a more traditional manner, orally, to help treat his sore throat. We also recovered several bromo seltzer and alcohol bottles from the site. I find this significant because coal miners have historically been criticized for their alcohol consumption, often being described in some sociological studies as alcoholics. However, when, again, considering Weaver's insights surrounding black lung, this description lacks room for circumstantial stresses that may have encouraged high levels of alcohol consumption. Given that throughout the majority of the 20th century, black lung had no effective treatment, Weaver actually notes that miners suffering from the disease frequently turned to alcohol as a form of self-medication. Seeking to ease pain, it can be argued that the described abuse and dependence on alcohol stemmed from or was influenced by the suffering caused by a debilitating disease such as black lung. Future analysis of alcohol bottle frequencies in different sections of the village could help provide insight into how issues of alcohol dependence may have disproportionately impacted colliery workers on the lower rungs of the social ladder, but that has yet to be seen. Let's see here. All right, so though this was a singular case study, this brief discussion demonstrates some ways in which commonly recovered material culture at historical sites can be reframed to explore questions of health, disability, and well-being. So now I'll try to hurry up a bit, and we come to the residence of 38/40 Back Street, the area where new immigrants and the poorest members of the town resided. 38/40 Back Street is a double house, and Back Street has been remembered as being at the bottom of Eckley's social hierarchy. Although families lived in these houses through 1940, indoor plumbing or septic systems were never installed. Through the census, I was able to identify a number of residents from the 20s through 40s. In the 1920s, we have William Walsh, who was a blacksmith and a widower. Then on 40 Back Street, we have Thomas and Sophie Chabon and their 2 children. The Chabons were Galatian Polish, and Thomas was a minor. In the 30s, we had George and Mary Ondeck at 38 Back Street and George and Mary Charnigo on 40 Back Street. Both were minors. Both were first-generation Pennsylvania-born to Czechoslovakian immigrants. And then in the 1940s, George and Mary are still at 38 Back Street, and Michael and Julia Drabala have moved to 40 Back Street. And George is still listed as being a minor, while Michael Drabala is listed as being a roadman. And George and Michael both actually grew up only a few houses down from their current residences. Michael at 9 Back Street and George at 26 Back Street. So there's a notable aspect of these residence patterns that is occurring at 38 Back Street. It's very similar to that of 104 Main Street, right? However, there are some stark differences in regards to material evidence of how pain, injury, and illness may have been treated. Despite being a minor, just like Anthony Sokolsky, it seems that George Ondeck was never recorded as an applicant to any type of UMWA, silicosis, or disability aid. This could be because of a number of reasons, including structural barriers, such as socioeconomic status and ethnicity. One possibility, of course, is that George Ondeck was one of the lucky ones who never developed black lung or suffered a traumatic or disabling disease or injury from his extended work in the colliery. Another possibility is that George Ondeck opted not to be a member of the UMWA and therefore did not have access to these resources. Opting out could have been the result of not wanting to pay union dues and or other social deterrents such as fear of repercussion or replacement by the company with the influx of new Southern and Eastern European immigrants that came to the region in the early 20th century. However, since I was unable to find any recordation of George Ondeck in a number of UMWA archival resources, these possibilities have to remain speculation rather than concrete fact. A more tangible understanding of how being on the bottom rungs of the social hierarchy at Eckley Minor's village manifested in issues of health can be explored a little more easily through the archaeological record. So when it comes to materials that could have been associated with healthcare needs at both 38 and 40 Back Street, there was a notably lower frequency and diversity of medicine and alcohol bottles. And even fewer could be identified beyond being a patent or prescription medicine bottle. The only distinctly identifiable alcohol-related artifact was actually a beer tankard that had a mean manufacturing date of 1905. So this is even before the Ondecks resided in the home. No brand or product information for the bottles that have a mean manufacturing date falling within the time period where we can identify former residents could be discerned from the fragmented collections. And this is in and of itself is a notable absence in comparison to the assemblage recovered from Anthony Sokolsky's home at 104 Main Street. Possibly due to socioeconomic status, especially as George Ondeck was noted as only making $8,000 for the entire year of 1930. So potential health-related artifacts that were manufactured and deposited prior to the 1920s through 40s period of occupation, they actually differ significantly in that they primarily are made up of chemical and patent medicine bottles. So the presence of patent medicine bottles reveals a complex story of resource allocation patent medicines in the early 20th century, which are not to be confused with prescription medicines, were products that can be referred to as snake oil treatments oftentimes. The purchase of these products is an interesting note regarding the residents' purchase decisions, as they would have had the company doctor's fee regularly deducted from their paychecks, yet instead of seeking treatment from a service they had technically already paid for, they chose to treat their ailments through an outside source. The most interesting artifact from this site, in my opinion, is a Lysol bottle that was recovered. Invented in Germany in 1889 to combat a cholera epidemic, Lysol's reputation as an antiseptic spread pretty quickly. Soon after, Lysol was being used for birth control and feminine hygiene. Eventually advertised as a douching product in the 1920s through 50s, Lysol douching was thought to kill sperm and prevent pregnancy. It was also a cheaper alternative to condoms and diaphragms. However, Lysol was also very dangerous, and by 1911, at least 5 women had died of Lysol poisoning while conducting uterine irrigation. Despite this, however, Lysol remained the most popular form of birth control in the United States until the oral contraceptive pill was introduced in 1960. While it's impossible to know whether this bottle of Lysol was being used for vaginal douching or other functions, the social norms of the time period combined with the brand-specific marketing speak to some pretty big issues surrounding issues of bodily autonomy, female agency, and child rearing in the poorest section of Eckley Miners Village. So while the assemblages from these 2 sites were only briefly highlighted, and to be sure, if I had another hour, there is plenty more we could delve into with these collections. The objects I chose to analyze here speak to some broader issues rooted in societal structures. So some of these include access to care and perceptions of health deservingness, i.e. who should have easy access to quality care. As was noted earlier, colliery company doctors tended to give priority treatment to minors over their wives and children, and this creates a tiered or hierarchical approach to how the company prioritized the health and well-being of their labor force over the overall well-being of the communities that they themselves helped to create. Outside of the company, unions were additional institutions that helped to provide health care. However, membership to the union was often a prerequisite for access to this care. These systems, which highlight various avenues of eligibility for healthcare, despite operating long before our current medical infrastructure, you know, they're arguably similar to the insurance-based system we see today. Quality of care continues to be reliant on membership to a preferred group. Historically, at Eckley, this could mean belonging to the union or being a minor. Whereas today in Northeastern Pennsylvania, this would mean having a full-time job with benefits. Either way, both past and present, these structures systematically leave people out. So to conclude, by considering health inequities and the perilous employment conditions colliery workers faced, as well as the working conditions of laborers in Northeastern Pennsylvania today, archaeologists can and should contribute meaningful discussions and insights into the ways structural violence have impacted health over time, and how the social gradient can be seen in material culture and architectural assemblages. Though this was only a brief analysis of how these forces manifest at Eckley, you know, I hope I've been able to provide an example to you all of how archaeologists can explore questions of health and well-being at industrial company towns. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kyla. That was interesting. Very interesting. So I will turn it over to Harold and Cindy if you've got some comments for Kyla or some overall comments. And then let me remind our attendees that if you've got some questions you want to post, we can respond to them from the Q&A section.
I'd just like to ask Kyla, what surprised you the most coming to Eckley and working there? Did anything really kind of stand out?
Probably just how embedded into the local community Eckley Miners Village is. It has a surprisingly large volunteer base, given the rural area it's located within. And I think that's a testament to, you know, not just familial connections to the site, but also that it's been able to embed itself as, you know, a community institution that helps people connect to their past.
Thanks.
I thought that it was really interesting as well, Kyla, as a fellow bottle digger, who I didn't realize that that had such benefits for research, you know, as you pointed out. I was curious in the socioeconomic portion of your study, you had mentioned that, you know, the women and children were pretty much left out of a lot of the healthcare and so forth. What about the breaker boys? I mean, I don't know. I'm not I've never studied Eckley, but I assume just with the time, you know, stamp and all that, that there were breaker boys. Would that change the medical treatment that they received if the boys, you know, in the home worked in the breaker?
Yeah, they would. They were considered an active part of the labor force at Eckley, rather than children per se. But not only that, the breaker was also a space where those healing from other injuries were sent to still maintain a level of productivity. So those working in the breaker, both young and old, were still seen as valuable parts of the labor system through the company, and therefore prioritized by the company doctor.
So it really was a gender separation then, you know, speaking with children, it would primarily be the female children and the wives that were left out of the medical care, and you know, if you were male or a boy, you were considered, you know, cared for. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can't speak to how the doctors specifically at Eckley operated, but Susan Weaver has a really great book on anthracite caregiving and health. Health in the anthracite coal region. And she provides a pretty interesting analysis of how company doctors interacted with their communities, as well as exploring gender in like folk medicine and more traditional healing. Additionally, there were some of the silk mills in the region, which had their own doctors. And as the labor force there was primarily female, I would assume, I would need to double check Ms. Weaver's work, but I would assume they are prioritized at the mills doctors.
Thank you.
I think it's also interesting that, I mean, looking at social gradients, you know, the people that lived on Back Street also had the farthest walk to get to the doctor's office. They might have had a 2/3 of a mile walk to get there. So that may have been some kind of a disincentive, you know, to make the trek in the wintertime if you had to go seek medical care. Well, does anyone else have any questions for our presenters? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Sarah Pacini, Sarah Sporco, Kyla and John gave great, very interesting presentations. And Cindy and Harold from Penn State Schuylkill, thank you again very much. And mention again, University of Maryland and Lackawanna Historical Society, great partners for the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Eckley Miners Village. So we really appreciate everybody joining us today. We had a nice group, nice audience. And thank you again for all of our presenters, and I hope that we can do this all again pretty soon. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a good night. Bye.